The conquest of Palestine, the colonization of Palestine, the subjugation of Palestine, this genocide, these are not things that are simply only about Palestine itself. Of course, we don't want to minimize the Palestinian national question and the question of Palestinian sovereignty, but the denial of sovereignty to Palestinians, and again, the conquest of Palestine is a part of a broader regional project that is core to the exercise of U.S. Global power. The maintenance of the axis of resistance, the maintenance of resistance forces in the region is really pivotal to actual real Palestinian sovereign reclamation going forward. But that's not just for Palestine, that's for the whole region, right? Like I think then for the people of Yemen to exercise real sovereignty, the people of Syria, people of Libya, in Iran and elsewhere to actually have a sovereign basis is a broader regional question as well.
Hello, everyone. I'm Rania Khalek, and this is Dispatches. The struggle for justice in Palestine isn't just a fight against the settler colonial Zionist project. It's a struggle against U.S. imperialism itself. To discuss this and more, I'm joined by Bikrum Gill, a political scientist and author of the forthcoming book, The Political Ecology of Colonial Capitalism: Race, Nature, and Accumulation. But before we jump into it, this is just part of this episode. The full interview is available to Breakthrough News members only. You can become a member at patreon.com/Breakthrough News. And as always, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the bell so you get a notification whenever we post new content. And if you appreciate this show, you can also donate below on YouTube. Bikram, welcome back to the show.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me back.
Well, it's great to have you back. There is so much to talk about. In the past, every time I've had you on, we've discussed imperialism in various ways, and we're going to do that again. But we're going to talk about that in relation to Palestine. So let's start off with imperialism and the Palestine question. You know, now that Palestine and Gaza are dominating the world's attention, can you explain to our audience why is the fight for liberation of Palestine also or actually a fight against U.S. imperialism?
So it is, I think there's some self-evident reasons why it is not just a fight against Zionist colonialism. It's not just a fight against Zionism. Self-evidently, we can see that the United States has always been a major backer of the Zionist state, that it provisions, as it has over the past 6 months, it has provisioned large amounts of weapons. It provides political cover consistently. So there is a self-evident reality we can grasp where it would not be possible for Zionism and the Zionist project to continue without U.S. support. I think that's a very basic point that's worth reiterating. This has been something that even Israeli Zionist media has constantly emphasized, is that if there wasn't these constant arms transfers, it'd be very difficult for the genocide to continue, for the Israeli colonial project to sustain itself. So I think at a very basic level, it is not enough to simply say the Palestinian struggle is in opposition to Zionism, when behind Zionism clearly stands U.S. imperialism in a material and a political register. So I think that's a very important point to begin with. So it is necessarily an anti-imperialist struggle. It is a fight against U.S. imperialism, because materially, without U.S. imperialism, this project could not go on. And there are specific material interests that the U.S. has in the subjugation of Palestine and the ongoing colonization of Palestine, which I know we're going to get into some of those a bit later on. But I think that's maybe a key point. And I just want to maybe elaborate on that a little bit here, is that I think very often there's a category error that people make where they think that a colonizer-colonized relationship can be isolated from a broader world system, right? So you can have a resistance against Zionism and maybe even appeal to U.S. imperialism as a way to facilitate Palestinian liberation struggle. And I know we're going to get into some of that later on as well, but I think that's a mistake that is made. That somebody like Ghassan Kanafani, even thinking about British imperialism, was placed a strong emphasis on, is that the conquest of Palestine is core to the entire imperialist world system. So you got to get out of this one-to-one understanding that the struggle is just a colonizer-colonized that in fact Palestine is central to the whole imperialist world system. And what we mean by imperialism, beyond just a colonizer-colonized one-to-one system, relationship, is an imperialist system where you have a core and a primary imperial power, which is the United States, which through a monopoly on military and financial capital is able to impose relationships on the entirety of the periphery, not just Palestine. But Palestine is key to this. So yeah, I would just start off by saying that. Like, you can see very clearly there's a need for the defeat of U.S. imperialism, for Palestinian liberation, right? Because it is this that acts as the backstop for Israeli power.
No, it's all a really, really, really good point. And I just want you to elaborate a bit, because I'm gonna, kind of zoom in on a lot of those points that you made, and we can dissect them a bit more. But some people might say, like, why focus on this when obviously, like, we're talking about a genocide in Gaza and we should be focused on Israel, Palestine, and like, why make it about this broader struggle? So I'm curious if you cocould explain why it's so important to incorporate anti-imperialism into our analysis of Palestine.
Right, exactly. So I think that's where I will say that it is vital. I'll go back to the point I just made, right? So when we have the writings of Ghassan Kanafani, what is the emphasis there? Is that, like, there's a mistake that the Palestinian elite made, or not just the Palestinian elite, or others might make from the inception or the beginnings of the Zionist project, that you can appeal to the imperial power, that you can appeal to British imperialism or U.S. imperialism, go around and try to get the U.S. to abandon, let's say, the Zionist state, and to support Palestinian liberation, right? So it becomes this question of, rather than focusing on how Palestinian resistance can challenge not just Zionist power, but imperialist power, by not understanding Palestine as an anti-imperialist struggle, the move can be, okay, you fight Zionist colonialism, but you seek to appeal to U.S. imperialism for protection. You seek to appeal to U.S. imperialism to enforce laws and rules and et cetera that it's never going to do, right? So I think it's really pivotal to understand that it is, in fact, U.S. imperialism that is the primary contradiction in Palestine, right? That the subjugation of Palestine is core to the maintenance and reproduction of U.S. imperial control over key resources, over U.S. financial power that it exercises, not only over the global south, but over its own quote unquote allies in Europe and elsewhere, right? So I think the question of anti-imperialism is fundamental, right? It's only through the defeat of U.S. imperialism in the region that Palestinian liberation can really take hold, right? Because it is through that defeat that the conditions for actual sovereignty for not just Palestinians, but all peoples across the region will become possible. So I'll just say, rather than appeal to U.S. imperialism to protect Palestinians against Zionism, and sometimes that appeal is, hey, we agree with you, U.S. imperialism on every other issue, just come and recognize Palestinian rights. The correct move is to actually contest and seek to weaken U.S. imperial power and defeat it. So that removes the source of support and backstop that enables Zionism to continue to do this, right? So it is fundamentally an anti-imperialist struggle that is actually key to the broader world systemic challenge to U.S. imperialism today.
And when we talk about, Palestine as a U.S. or colonizing Palestine as really a U.S. imperialist project, why? What does the U.S. get out of it? Why is the U.S. backing a genocide in Gaza? Because obviously they wouldn't do it unless they're benefiting in some way.
Right. So the U.S. is definitely benefiting, but I would say there's something even much more at stake for the U.S. than simply benefiting. I think right now the U.S. imperial power has been challenged in a way in our contemporary conjunction in a way it never has before. Right? It's come to crisis. Not simply we can think about what's happened in the context of the war in Ukraine over the past few years with the rise of China. So you have this clear weakening of the basis of U.S. imperialism. I think so. The need to uphold and maintain the Zionist proxy is kind of a really existential crisis for U.S. imperialism, right? And I think, for an example, the agreement that China helps broker between Iran and Saudi Arabia last year, right? It clearly opens a very different regional configuration that could really fundamentally and permanently undermine the U.S. regional order, through which the U.S. has maintained a certain relationship between the oil and the US dollar that has been key to how the US has enforced dependency of other states upon it for its exercise of imperialist power, right? So the US cannot allow for Israel to fall. It cannot allow for Zionism to weaken because it is key to the projection of US power in West Asia, which is key to the projection of US power globally, right? So this is and I know we're going to get into later on, but that dollar oil relationship has been very key to how it has subjugated Germany and Japan underneath it, to how it has subjugated the global South more generally. And so the question of the interest the U.S. has in the genocide is that if the Palestinians are not disarmed, if they're not deterred, right, which will bring about an existential crisis in the Israeli state, then this will remove a key, let's say, proxy bulwark of U.S. imperial power in the region. Now, there are, of course, direct benefits that the U.S. gets in terms of we can think about the military-industrial complex. We can think about weapons companies and the profits they make. But I think more fundamentally, this is a strategic question that the United States is confronting because it is part of the U.S.'s refusal to entertain the possibility of an emergent multipolar world, right? The desire to maintain imperialist domination over the entire world necessitates the maintenance of U.S. absolute domination over West Asia, which necessitates the Zionist proxy to maintain those relations.
Well, I mean, that's a really, really excellent way to frame it. And I think that something you were alluding to earlier, I want to touch on that. And here's how I'll put it, is I think there's this stream of liberalism, that in recent years had become increasingly vocal on the issue of Palestine because of what Israel does is just so horrific, right? It's just this like segregationist, like far-right fascistic settler colony. But when I talk about this particular stream of liberalism, they speak of Palestine in, pro-Palestine terms, but they do it while remaining very silent or in some cases even supportive of imperialist policies in the rest of the region. And here, I mean, the kinds of people who will be, for example, pro-Palestine, but then also they supported the regime change war on Syria, or they supported the NATO intervention in Libya, or you could even go out of the US. These are the kinds of people who might, support NATO's encroachment around Russia and the ongoing, funding of this endless war in Ukraine to bleed the Russians. You'll have a person who thinks all of those things from a very liberal imperialist perspective. But then on Palestine, they're like, oh, no, that's occupation. It's horrible, which is great. I'm glad they understand occupation is bad. However, this can be very problematic. So why is it crucial to sort of prevent that stream of liberalism from dominating? Because I think what the part that I think is really dangerous here is that they tend to be quite successful as isolating Palestine from the rest of the region. So I guess here I'm asking you to explain how and why you can't have a genuinely liberated Palestine without getting rid of U.S. imperialism in the rest of the region. Like, it's not like you can just be good on Palestine and not on anything else, because the two go together.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think the examples that you raise, particularly around the proxy war in Syria and in Libya and even Ukraine, I think those are very important examples that are part of an interconnected project to maintain U.S. imperialism, right? So I think, again, the first point to emphasize once again is that the conquest of Palestine, the colonization of Palestine, the subjugation of Palestine, this genocide, these are not things that are simply only about Palestine itself. Of course, we don't want to minimize the Palestinian national question and the question of Palestinian sovereignty, but the denial of sovereignty to Palestinians, and again, the conquest of Palestine is a part of a broader regional project that is core to the exercise of U.S. Global power, right? And before that, British global power. So what do we mean by that? Is that we know from British imperialism's embrace of Zionism and its working with Zionism, a key objective there is to establish, at a very basic level, imperialist control over the hydrocarbon wealth of the region. Now, of course, you can do this through local proxies, the Saudis and other client states, right? But there is a way in which Zionism is understood to be a direct Western implantation in the region, right? That can allow for a more acute and sharper form of political and military control and projection of power in the region. Now, that control over oil And the link up it's had with the dollar has been key, like I mentioned, to US imperial power and its projection across the world. So that's one point worth emphasizing, right? That the conquest of Palestine is a part of a broader regional dynamic to deny sovereignty to the peoples of the region in order to control the flow of resources into and out of the region in a way that benefits US capitalist imperialism. So that's one thing. Now, the second point, though, is in isolating Palestine from the broader regional dynamics, the point is to weaken Palestinian resistance. And it behooves the left and those in solidarity with Palestine to understand this, right? If you're in solidarity with Palestine, but you're not attendant to the dynamics that are either strengthening or weakening actually material Palestinian resistance, then what you risk doing is transforming your engagement with Palestine into one in which at most what you can do is beg for the West or the imperialists to recognize Palestine and to save Palestine and to afford Palestine some autonomy, right? But what are the concrete conditions for Palestinian liberation, right? The concrete conditions are to challenge the terms through which Palestinians have been denied sovereignty and people across the rest of the region, right? Now, how has this occurred as well? It's been through the overwhelming military power that Zionism has exercised in the region vis-a-vis with the support first of British imperialism and then US imperialism, right? So now to understand the example of Syria that you emphasize here, we know that in the 1980s, of course, that the invasion of Beirut leads to the disarming of the Palestinians, right? It leads to an Oslo Road, which is a part of the apex of US imperial power at the end of the century. The end of history, there's no alternative, get in line, just play by the rules that the United States has set. And the Western world more generally has set. So global South states, they have to beg for loans and credit and accept structural adjustment conditions. And in the Oslo framework, the Palestinians have to lay down their arms and basically depend upon some idea of US beneficence or goodwill to ensure that they will eventually get a state, that their land will not be stolen, and et cetera. But we know that doesn't happen through Oslo. Land theft accelerates, and there is no road to Palestinian sovereignty because there's no material basis to it because the Palestinians have been disarmed in the lead up to Oslo. But what else is happening in the region? Of course, we know that the Iranian Revolution, the rise of Hezbollah in Lebanon, the eventual emergence of an axis, a corridor between Iran, Syria, and Hezbollah that establishes an actual material force, a material basis with which to challenge Zionist and US imperial power in the region, right? So there's a material basis being built through which now there can be a shift from dependency, right, from a certain kind of begging and hopefulness that imperialism will grant you rights, to actually raising up a military power, a force capacity that can become the real basis for sovereignty. Right? What is sovereignty, right? Exercising sovereign power over your resources, your lands, your labor, in a way that is not dependent on an imperial power. Well, then you need to have a force to be able to stand up to the imperialists and the colonizer. So this is being raised up through this emerging alliance in the 80s and 90s and 2000s. And we know, of course, we've discussed this before, but Hezbollah is very successful in doing so. And in 2006, when they defeat Israel, actually to take a step back, the successes of Hezbollah in the 1980s and 90s is what inspires the Palestinian Second Intifada, which again then introduces this equation of force through which settlers are expelled from Gaza. So we're seeing a different road emerging, a real road to real Palestinian sovereignty, which is a part of a road to broader regional sovereignty for peoples across the region more generally, right? Now, how do the imperialists respond is you have Tony Blair speak of a Shia crescent in 2006. You have the King of Jordan using the same language, right? And actually Jordan and Egypt are very good examples here of how you have these two states that maybe at one point represented strategic depth for Palestinian resistance, at one point represented a depth of supporting armed struggle, of armed resistance in the 60s and 70s earlier, then become a support for Zionism and imperialism, right? So this is what's being attempted to be imposed upon Syria after 2006. Syria becomes clearly a target to disrupt this weapons corridor, to disrupt the material basis of a rising challenge to imperialism and Zionism that is both inspiring and supporting Palestinian resistance, right? So insofar as there is an attempt to de-link these struggles, right, to de-link Palestinian liberation struggle from the U.S. attempt to repress this axis by conducting a proxy war in Syria. Right? This is a very it has certain very risky implications, right? Because what it will do is will again and again return Palestinians to a dependent state. Right? You remove, if you smash the Syrian state, you smash the Libyan state, if you destroy Yemen, if you destroy all of these regional forces that are actually constructing a power, a real concrete power to challenge imperialism, then you will leave Palestine again isolated and dependent and only hoping for the goodwill of Western civil society, right? So I think that is really, I think one thing that I would emphasize very strongly is that the maintenance of the axis of resistance, the maintenance of resistance forces in the region is really pivotal to actual real Palestinian sovereign reclamation going forward. But that's not just for Palestine, that's for the whole region, right? Like I think then for the people of Yemen to exercise real sovereignty, the people of Syria, people of Libya, in Iran and elsewhere to actually have a sovereign basis is a broader regional question as well.
And you touched on U.S. I guess the resources in the region, and that's obviously like the resource of oil is very important. I'm curious if you could maybe explain the U.S. dollar oil relationship and how that projects U.S. power through the region and really beyond through its control over the region.
Yeah, I think so. That's key, and it's something that I think it's useful to spend some time on. So, when we think about something that I've kind of been circling back to here is when we think about what is imperialism. Okay, so colonialism can be a direct one-to-one. The colonizer colonizes a colonized population. You have a one-to-one relationship. Now, imperialism is a broader structure, right, through which an imperial power imposes relations of dependency. So even if you're formally free, you depend upon the imperial court for access to key resources, without which you cannot engage in projects of economic development that are required to maybe stabilize your society and your state to some extent. Right? And now that enables a constant value flow, a surplus value flow from the periphery to the core. Now, imperialism does this. It does this not by exercising always direct territorial control, right? It's not like that the imperialism necessitates always that they usurp the sovereignty of Saudi Arabia, or that there's a usurpation of the sovereignty of certain states. What is key for imperialism is controlling the flow of capital across borders. Who has sovereign power over the flow of capital and key commodities into and out of key regions and across borders, right? Now that is very key. So now obviously the key commodity in our world system for the past century has been oil, right? Now that's very clear, but there is a specific way in which the United States tied up the oil with the dollar in the 1970s, right? Now this was done in order to maintain U.S. power over both its quote-unquote allies and the global south at a moment of declining U.S. economic competitiveness, right? So after World War II, there's a collective imperialism that Samir Amin argues emerges, right, between the U.S., EU, and Japan. By the 1970s, though, there's contradictions that are emerging here, where Germany and Japan are starting to outcompete the United States, right? And the U.S. has been in a state of declining economic competitiveness for half a century. We clearly see that in relation to China today, right? So now at the same time, global South states are rising in an era of decolonization, trying to undertake import substitution industrialization, trying to establish the basis of sovereign industrialization. So there's a material basis through which you can contest neocolonialism, overcome dependency. So what the United States does in the 1970s, after the 1973 war, it establishes an agreement with Saudi Arabia, through which, actually just to take a step back, now why does it do so is because, France and other of its allies actually start calling in the US dollar. This is very well known, right? In the 1960s, de Gaulle and others say, we don't think the dollar is actually a safe, worthwhile reserve currency. We would like to call it in for gold, right? And we know Nixon then delinks the dollar from gold. And at that moment, very shortly thereafter, the United States then makes an agreement with Saudi Arabia to essentially relink the dollar with oil, right? So there's a 1974 agreement with Saudi Arabia through which oil will be sold in dollars, and the U.S. will provide a military security umbrella to protect Saudi Arabia. So what does that do? by forcing or linking up all sale of oil with US dollars, that means even if Germany is outcompeting the United States, even if Japan is outcompeting the United States or any global South state, they need oil for any form of production. Right now, to have oil, then you have to hold US dollars. Right. So what this does is it provisions the United States with a depth of financial power, right, through which they're able to both skim off the top of all economic activities without being a productive player in any of them. What the Chinese have recently been calling US seigniorage power, through which they profit by having the global reserve currency. But then it also, what it leads to is it leads to capital constantly parking itself in US banks. And then US banks then are able to control the provisioning of capital and loans to the global South. And it produces and increases this dependency, which really consolidates by the 1990s era of globalization, right? So the oil-dollar relationship restores US financial supremacy, even though there isn't a hard economic basis. The US is not the most economically competitive nation, but because it links the oil with dollar, it's able to restore a certain financial supremacy, which renews the dependency of the South on the United States, but it also subjugates its allies underneath it once again, which is, of course, as we've discussed, I think, when I've been on the program before, one of the key objectives of the war in Ukraine, right, is to continually subjugate its European allies underneath it, so Europe doesn't look to establish relations with Russia and China that might lead to a multipolar world rather than a world dominated by US imperialism. So I think that's the key element of the dollar-oil relationship. It's been fundamental to US hegemony and imperialism. And it's been projected and maintained through, obviously, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Israel in the region, right? So these are the proxy forces through which the United States projects power. And I think, again, to return to the previous question, one reason why the US is making such a stand right now in so aggressively backing this genocide is because the Iran-Saudi detente that happened last year, the ending of the Yemen war, right? And China is constantly working with others, Russia, Iran, or whoever, to think about an alternative currency system that can weaken the US ability to dominate the world economy through the dollar, right? So the Iran-Saudi relationship opens up a different horizon for the region, right? And I think that's one reason why you're seeing the US trying to push a normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel and trying to really shore up Israel at this moment in which it is being challenged in a way it hasn't before.
Oh, wow. I mean, when you say it all like that, it becomes so clear who the actual enemy is. And it's a big one. It's a big one. And it's important to express that when we talk about the colonization of Palestine. And then I want to go back to again, because I feel like this point has been made, but can you kind of like speak to the centrality of the colonization of Palestine to everything you just said? Because I want to just emphasize that as much as possible, because a lot of people don't recognize necessarily the connection between controlling this area when it comes to the US domination of the entire region and everything you just talked about.
Right. So I mean, I think we know that what is that famous quote that Joe Biden actually said in the 1980s, right? If there wasn't an Israel,
yeah,
we would have to create one, right? So, and I may be mistaken, but I don't think it is maybe Biden who said that, but there's been characterizations of Israel as this giant aircraft carrier for the United States, right? This massive store of basically U.S. weapons and ability to project military power throughout the region, right? So now we know, for example, in the proxy war in Syria, that the Zionist state played a key role in backing those forces that were working with the U.S. to smash the Syrian state and to basically undermine the axis of resistance in that way, right? So there's a concrete way through which I think Israel does act as a proxy force in the region, and that there's a way in which through the U.S., Saudi, Israel, I think Turkey relationship, there's a way in which it kind of enables and allows for this projection of military power via Israel, and it enables, I think, the Saudi-U.S. relationship to be stabilized as well, which is why I think they're pushing for normalization. So I think at the basic point, though, imagine if you don't have an Israel in the region. Like, just imagine, like, as a thinking exercise, imagine you remove remove Israel from the region with a liberated Palestine, right? Like a historic Palestine becomes liberated, and you don't have that. Can we imagine the United States maintaining an imperialist power in the same way when we're already seeing, for example, Saudi Arabia talking to Iran via China? Now, this is not to say the Saudis are some revolutionary force. They're very opportunistic, but there is a way in which you can see if you remove Zionism as a proxy in the region, it would change the equation for the local client states that the U.S. Upholds otherwise. So I think very much there has to be an emphasis that the liberation of Palestine is key. It's actually at the center of the struggle against U.S. imperialism, which has incredible, obviously, bearings for the entire global South, for much of those states that are on the periphery, right? If the liberation of Palestine weakens or eliminates the U.S. hold over the region, this will open up developmental space for the entire, I think, global South. So I think anti-imperialists really need to key in on the centrality of the Palestinian struggle.
And then, I want to just, I've actually talked to Ali Qadri on the show about this, who I know is someone whose work that you've read in full. And he speaks to this very well. And I want to ask you about it. When it comes to U.S. imperialism in the region, I mean, we've talked about the dollar hegemony, the oil, the resources, but what else does the U.S. get out of the Middle East? Because when we think about Africa or Latin America, there's a bit more diversity of resources, I would say, than you have in a place like the Middle East or West Asia. Same thing, but some people don't know that when we say West Asia, we mean Middle East. But I mean, the kind of, when we think about like Africa and Latin America, there's other things. There's like copper and coffee and, cobalt and just so much. Whereas in the Middle East, it's just oil. But I think it's even beyond oil, isn't it? I mean, yes, the Middle East produces oil, but also it almost seems as though when it comes to the Middle East specifically, war has become a resource in and of itself. In a way where like all of these U.S. weapons and, global North companies that sell weapons make a killing off of selling weapons to be used to destroy the Middle East. And so I'm just curious if you can speak to that aspect of imperialism in the region.
Yeah, so that's very important, and what I would maybe begin by emphasizing is if I can be allowed to retreat into theory for a moment.
Please, on the show always.
So there's in the history of Marxist theorizations of imperialism, right? There's a dominant, I think, or a more conventional, let's say, approach, that's coming out of, or let's say dominant, that's coming out of Lenin and others, that will emphasize that when capitalism hits a profitability crisis in the core, right? So whether it's the United States or European countries, if once their firms hit a crisis of profitability where there's a market saturation or the capital-labor relationship in a core only allows, you cannot reinvest profits anymore to generate even further profits, that capitalism will will intensify imperialism, but will also turn to financialization, which we talked about with the oil-dollar relationship, right? This was the financialization of the U.S. economy. This was the financialization of the world economy, through which, in the absence of being able to renew and generate further profits in the real economy, right, because of declining competitiveness for the U.S., but also rising competitiveness elsewhere, the contradictions of capitalism reaching a limit of profitability, there's a turn to finance, right? But there is a second road, which is what you're pointing to, that Rosa Luxemburg actually first pointed to, as far as I'm aware. And I think Ali Qadri's work, and I think Ali Qadri has recently co-authored a piece with somebody who's been on your program recently, Matteo Capasso, a couple of, they wrote a very important
Shout out
piece.
To Matteo if you're watching. Yeah, and if you're not, what the hell are you doing?
Shout out to Conrad Matteo for
Conrad
sure.
Matteo.
Yeah. Brilliant analysis always. But yes, so also I had co-written a piece with Ali Qadri on this specific theme. So I know they have engaged Luxemburg somewhat, but in her book, I think The Accumulation of Capital, she has an entire chapter there on militarism as a province of accumulation, which is getting at exactly what you're saying. She's looking at how war doesn't simply become a means to grabbing resources, that war is the end in itself, that when you hit a profitability crisis, right, when the contradictions of the capital-labor relation cannot be overcome, when the contradictions of inter-firm competition, of inter-imperialist competition or whatnot cannot be overcome, turning to war actually becomes a way in which accumulation can be renewed within the sphere of war itself, right? Because you can generate a kind of social buy-in by all peoples, from working classes to the capitalist class, a total collective social effort is bought into a war-making project that enables massive amounts of profits to be regenerated, right? So war becomes an escape from the crisis of profitability as well for Luxembourg. And I think this is something that Kadri's work with Matteo has emphasized, and I think so. It becomes a means of profit, not just to grab copper, not just to grab oil, but to actually make a profit, because you can't make profits elsewhere. And we know that since the 1970s, not only has the U.S. economy financialized, right, that it has essentially become really centered. Whatever productive basis there is to the U.S. economy is tied with the military industry, right? So there has been both a financialization and a militarization of U.S. capital accumulation since the 1970s, and it is more broad amongst Western capitalist countries themselves, right? And this is particularly becoming sharp as China and other contending states further intensify the crisis of their competitive basis in the global economy, right? So I think that militarized sphere of accumulation has been key as well to the financialized sphere since the 1970s. And the West Asian region, the Middle Eastern region, has been a key site, as Kadri's work has shown, through which war has become a key profit-making arena. And now Kadri will also emphasize there that part of the objective of war is to smash these societies as well, right? So you smash the capacity of the Libyan or Syrian states to engage in some form of non-market-based social reproduction of its societies, which ends up actually imposing levels of destruction, which release forms of surplus labor that can have the impact of depressing labor costs more generally across the world, which can, again, enhance profits, right? So I think most definitely it's important that we keep up front and center that these wars, whether it's the war in Iraq, in Libya, in Syria, in Ukraine, that there is a fundamental structural impetus coming out of the US economy to continue to pump and push for war making as an arena of profit making. And the West Asian region has been key to that. So I would just say, in addition to the financialization component we talked about, militarization has been key to the maintenance and reproduction of U.S. capitalist accumulation since the 1970s in particular.
Wow, that's like a really, it kind of blows my mind when you put it all like that, that war is a resource. War has become a resource because of the profitability of it and this disgusting war machine that has become so foundational to the West's ability to continue to profit off of the world. I want to move on to a couple other regional issues that are obviously very much related to the genocide in Gaza. I want to talk about Iran and the resistance axis. And I don't know if you saw, but I recently was able to go on Piers Morgan.
I did see that. And well done. You did awesome.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. It was very, very stressful, by the way. It was a very stressful experience. So I'm happy with that it turned out in a way where, you know, it was at least some sort of like cathartic experience for people to watch these Zionists get yelled at by me. But
genocide apologists, that was good.
Genocide apologists, exactly. These genocide apologists. But there was this one Israeli American woman called Emily. And you might remember that she made this claim, and she made it repeatedly. Seriously, sitting through this was like a form of torture to have to just listen to these people's insane talking points. But she kept saying that Iran is a colonizer. She was trying to use the words colonizer and imperialist. She tried to say that I don't know what they mean, and she does. And that it's actually Iran that's colonizing Lebanon, and it's an imperialist power in the region. And I mean, she sounded insane, but there are people who believe this because it's said so often about Iran. Like Iran is like or there's this term like sub-imperialism that some sort of like a certain strain of people in the like left sphere will use when referring to a country like Iran. But, you know, Israel supporters do like to like project, you know, Israel's colonialism and imperialism onto Iran and say it's Iran that's imperialist, it's Iran that's colonizing Lebanon. But, you know, I want to emphasize, Bikrum, and you know this as an academic, that these words have actual meanings. Like imperialism and colonialism they both have a definition. So can you explain to our viewers why Iran does not qualify as an imperialist, let alone colonial power?
Yeah, absolutely. I think to understand, say, colonialism and imperialism, right? It's very clearly these are two, and just I think maybe for your viewers and listeners, I recently gave a lecture at Middle East Critique where I think I go into this in a lot more detail. Like it's a very long kind of lecture where if people want some more longer definitions, but very briefly, like colonialism and imperialism is a set of relationships through which either a colonizing power or an imperial power is going to organize and dominate the colonized society, the subjugated society, in a way that denies sovereignty to those people in order to transfer resources and surplus value from the colonized, imperially subjugated zone into the colonizer country or into the imperial core. Right? So that's, I think, very key. It's not enough to say that if one country has a relationship with another through which they are maybe engaged in some forms of relations of power, or they're engaged in some forms of military collaboration or cooperation, or engaged in a conflict in a neighboring country, that automatically qualifies as colonialism and imperialism. That is a very simplistic rendering, right? I think one thing that I often emphasize is like, look to see, does the relationship between these two countries, does it generate relations of development and underdevelopment? Does it generate relations through which, say, Iran's presence somewhere is actively underdeveloping that country, is actively de-developing and destroying the productive basis of that country in order to transfer wealth from that country to Iran? Where can you find that? You can't find that anywhere, right? So I think that definition of surplus value transfer of a militarized or economic basis to a denial of sovereignty that is done to transfer wealth from periphery to core, from colonized to colonizer, we can't see that with the case of Iran. And what I will further emphasize is that the Iranian Revolution in 1979 is itself a response to the colonization of Iran, to the imperial subjugation of Iran, the neo-colonial subjugation of Iran. Iran was the case par excellence in the 20th century of neo-colonial subjugation. And the relations we were talking about over US imperialism being premised upon domination over the flow of oil into and out of the region. The coup that happens in Iran in 1953 is a very key part of that project. And the Iranian Revolution in 1979, why does it become so threatening to US imperialism? Is because, in my view, it is actually a direct challenge to that 1974 US-Saudi relationship. Because the Iranian Revolution does not it stands with Palestinians from its inception. It's never abandoned the Palestinian cause. It's been given opportunities to abandon it. If the Iranians abandoned Palestine, you can bet in one day they would be integrated into the region, right? That all of this discourse around rights and democracy and all this stuff, this is not anything that has ever been a concern. We know this to the West. So if they would have abandoned Palestine and accepted US hegemony, Iran could be integrated into the region by the US in a day. Those opportunities have been there. But from the Iranian Revolution, you can see the Iranian Revolution, and shout out to my haters, there's a lot of Zionists who are always like, oh my gosh, he said the Iranian Revolution is premised upon expelling the US from the region. Like, wow, that's a big controversial claim to make. But just to restate this point. I think
the revolution says as much too.
Exactly. Even Stephen Walt, or like these boring academics.
Yeah.
I mean, all these boring academics have made this point, right? But so the Iranian Revolution is itself, it centers on a rejection and opposition to Zionism, but also the expulsion of US imperialism from the region, understanding that there's no sovereignty to be had fully for Iranians or any people in the region while they are still there. So if you look at the history of Iran since 1979, whether one wants to be critical or supportive of any actions, what is very clear is the Iranian position is often informed in the immediate sense by its direct security imperatives in its border regions, right? Like that. And that's something you can apply also to China and Russia, right? You can see the way in which those states operate on a very different logic, through which they're not going to dominate and deny sovereignty in order to transfer surplus wealth from a periphery to a core. They're largely informed by security imperatives that are security imperatives in response to the actual imperialist power in these regions, which is the United States, right? So how does Iran operate in Iraq? Well, the Iranian presence in Iraq is going to be of a such to ensure that the United States can't go through Iraq and get to the doorstep of Iran, because we know that the next step is always regime change in Iran. Now, that's a very different logic than calling it an imperial or colonizing power, number one. But number two, Iran has been a very vital force to different resistance forces in the region. Now, that again, that's something that is a fact of the matter, right? Like you cannot understand. I think Amal Saad's work is very important in saying that Hezbollah is not a proxy of Iran. It's not a pawn of Iran. These are allies in an axis. But Iran has been a core part of that axis, right? Like it has been a core part of, just as Iran learned from North Korea how to develop an endogenous weapons production capacity, they have also helped to diffuse that knowledge across the region. So when you understand Yemen or Ansarullah or Hezbollah, how they've stood up as such sovereign forces that have endogenous force capacity, Iran is a key part of that question, right? So it has been key to the challenge to US imperialism in the region. It is certainly not operating according to the logics of imperialism and colonialism by any means. I think that's important to emphasize, which that doesn't mean that any state doesn't have degrees of social discontent that people can analyze. None of that does away with that, but it's to be very clear as to what is and is not happening, and also to be clear of why Iran is targeted, right? Iran is targeted for the specific reason of how it challenges US imperialism in the region.
Right. And then to speak to, other arms of the resistance axis, I wanted to ask you to comment on the fact that we have groups like Hezbollah and Hamas, which are Islamist groups. Iran itself is a religious country. It had an Islamic, it had its Islamic revolution. So obviously there's a religious flavor to these movements, and in the case of Iran, this country. Can you explain why, despite all of that religious character, these are in fact anti-imperialist forces? And that's to say, I'm not sitting here saying that they're like necessarily leftist forces. I'm not calling them leftist forces. They certainly have like socially conservative views, and they're not necessarily all exactly the same. Like there's a lot of internal ideals that Hezbollah or Hamas might espouse that I would disagree with, because I myself am not a religious person. That said, these are still anti-imperialist forces because, again, imperialism has a definition. So can you explain the meaning behind that? Why are they anti-imperialist forces?
So I think they are definitely anti-imperialist forces. To be anti-imperialist, and I think you can go to Syed Hassan Nasrallah's. I think I caught a speech that he gave. This was long back. I don't know. I just caught it in passing, but it definitely exists because I often find Nasrallah to be one of the sharpest geopolitical analysts of our times. Actually, like when the 2006 war happens and there's this moment of revelation, maybe it had occurred to the Hezbollah leadership before, that is actually U.S. imperialism that is the primary contradiction and oppressive force, right? The
head of the snake, as
the head of the snake, right? Yeah. So that became definitely the line and a clear, sharp understanding. So what does it mean to be anti-imperialist, right? What it means to be anti-imperialist is to challenge the basis of imperialism, to challenge the basis through which imperialism denies sovereignty to a people, whether in a national context or in a regional context, right? So very clearly, both Hezbollah and Hamas have constructed a force capacity through which to do that, right? Now, that's why they are categorized as terrorist organizations by the United States. The United States is not going to categorize any organization that's not challenging U.S. imperialism. That's actually the qualifying condition, right? Like if you're challenging the basis of U.S. imperialist power, you will be categorized as a terrorist organization.
If you enjoyed this episode and want to hear the rest, you can access it by becoming a Breakthrough News member at patreon.com/breakthroughnews.